A small town is rocked by a vicious murder.
You find this man bound, hogtied.
He had experienced terror with a capital T.
The community is alerted to a dangerous criminal on the loose.
They met while he was in prison, and then he escaped. No one had seen or heard from her since he had disappeared.
Was she being removed against her will, or was she a participant?
As police race to find both a missing person and a fugitive, more troubling crimes come into focus.
We really didn't know where she was.
I'm thinking, oh my God, there's another potential victim.
And the search for the truth will expose a serial killing couple on a horrific crime spree.
I just wondered what kind of animal these two were that would do this to a person.
She said that he forced me to do it. I didn't want to, and I was just going along because I was scared of him.
This was a crime perpetrated by dangerous, calculating criminals, and it is the epitome of pure evil.
Lebanon County, Pennsylvania is known for its small-town charm.
Lebanon County is a relatively small county as far as population is concerned. Its total population is about 140,000 people.
You don't have to worry about your children. You didn't have to worry about walking down the street. This was small town USA.
But on September 25th, 1993, 911 dispatchers in the small borough of Palmyra receive a disturbing report about one of its citizens.
Palmyra Borough Police received a report that a 74-year-old resident named Guy Goodman hadn't been seen by his neighbors for days, and it was quite unusual.
His neighbors had grown concerned because his mail and his newspapers had piled up outside of his home.
Following up on the call, an officer with the Palmyra Borough Police Department arrives at Mr. Goodman's address to perform a welfare check. From the outside, the home appears dark and quiet.
When the officer arrived at Guy Goodman's apartment, he was able to look through a window and saw that the place was in disarray. He then went to the front door, which was unlocked, and as soon as he opened it, he was just confronted with a horrible smell.
The stench was overwhelming. By the time you get into the house, it was so bad that breathing was difficult.
There had been some sort of disturbance inside. There was a vase that was broken.
On the flooring in the hallway was a fair amount of blood. It was streaked as though something had been drugged from the hallway.
The officer follows the blood trail to a door and down a flight of stairs to the basement, where he is met by a gruesome sight.
When the officer went down into the basement, he found what looked to be a body, tightly wrapped in a bedspread.
While most of the body is concealed, it appears the victim is deceased.
His head was covered, but his one hand was, you could tell, was showing signs of decomposition.
The officer calls back to the police department and requests the homicide unit to arrive on scene because he believes he's found the remains of the missing homeowner, Guy Goodman.
Before he'd been reported missing, Guy Goodman had been enjoying a life of retirement. The 74-year-old had owned and operated a popular floral business in the community for nearly 2 decades.
I was friends of Guy Goodman. He was just one of these, like a Reader Digest guy. You know, he just, the most interesting character. It was just really nice to be able to talk and meet people like that.
He was well-known and well-respected throughout the entire community, not just in Palmyra, but throughout Lebanon County.
He was divorced and he lived alone. He had 2 grown children from that marriage who he raised in Lebanon County. His neighbors had nothing but kind things to say. Said he was a very generous man.
Faith played an important role in Guy's life. He was an active member of his church and enjoyed going on mission trips to help those less fortunate.
I'm president of a volunteer health organization. and we make trips usually into Central America. Guy expressed to me that he's always wanted to go on one of these trips, and he'd like to really help some people out.
Guy Goodman was quite the traveler, but he also was a gentleman who loved his community, and he regularly gave back to that community. He worked with a lot of charities and did a lot of good for many, many people.
I wouldn't call him wealthy, but certainly comfortable in terms of his ability to pay for his own needs and to give to others. And from all accounts, he was a very giving man.
But now it looks like Guy Goodman's life may have come to a tragic end. On September 25th, 1993, a body is found concealed in the basement of the retired florist's home.
I was the primary investigator on this particular homicide. I responded to the location and was met by Palmyra Borough Police Department. We found that after taking the bedspread off, then under that there was a sheet of plastic wrapped around the entire body, covering head to toe.
Decomposition makes visual identification impossible, but detectives make a few key findings.
He had 8 bindings on various portions of his body.
There was a cord around the neck used to bind the hands behind the back, and then that cord went further down and was used to tie the legs together so that it was basically hog-tying the victim.
He had a plastic bag over his head, so if he tried to wiggle free, he would use up the oxygen quicker.
As detectives were examining the remains, it became clear that he had been beaten in the back of his head. It was covered in blood.
It was obvious that this man died a horrific death.
Despite decomposition, the coroner is able to use dental records to identify the victim.
Authorities were able to positively ID the remains as belonging to Guy Goodman.
We were able to determine the body had been dead for at least a week.
Based on the multiple bindings and the bag left covering the victim's head, authorities conclude the cause of death to be asphyxiation.
We kept any knots that were utilized to bind him intact. Those items were collected along with the wrappings that were around the body.
Inside the main level of the home, investigators have uncovered evidence of a brutal attack.
We went through the house, just get an overall picture of what areas of the house may have been involved in the crime.
Detectives surmise the struggle had ended in the foyer, where the killer had hit Guy over the head.
There had been some sort of disturbance inside. There was a vase that was broken.
There was blood at the back of the hallway, going back through the living room.
Evidence suggests the killer tied Guy Goodman up with items found in the home.
Some of the drawers in the kitchen were partially open. It was obviously that some lights had been plugged in using extension cords. Those extension cords were initially missing, and the cord was missing from the phone.
Investigators suspect that after dragging Guy Goodman to the basement, the killer ransacked the residence.
Mr. Goodman's car was missing from the driveway, and there were also items missing from inside of his home.
Checks were missing, and they were also unable to find a credit card that had belonged to Mr. Goodman. So that immediately got them thinking, this is the motive. It was robbery.
One of the first things that police did was to contact the bank and contact the credit card company and put a trace on the use of any checks or credit cards.
In the meantime, detectives continue their search of Mr. Goodman's residence. They note that every exterior door and window appears to be intact.
There was no sign of a forced entry. It wasn't somebody who broke into the door or broke a window and crawled into the apartment. There was no sign of that.
And that was obviously a clue that the perpetrator was probably somebody that Guy Goodman knew.
Coming up, the case to find Guy Goodman's killer takes an unexpected turn when authorities discover a connection to a local prison.
Guy Goodman had actually signed up to go into the prison and help out, mentor troubled youth. Guy was trying to help him and turn his life around.
And police face a race against the clock to catch a criminal at large.
He was granted a conjugal visit evening furlough.
According to the prison sign-out sheet, he never signed back in.
In Palmyra, Pennsylvania, authorities are investigating the murder of retired florist Guy Goodman when they uncover evidence that Guy had likely invited the killer into his home. That theory gains momentum when detectives observe the kitchen table.
I noted that there were 3 cups sitting on the table. It looked as though 3 people had been sitting and having coffee or tea together prior to this, so it appeared as though whoever was involved was an invited guest into the home.
The number of cups also suggests that there may have been 2 perpetrators involved in the attack.
One of them was likely Guy Goodman, so it only stood to reason that the other 2 belonged to guests that Mr. Goodman had in his home prior to his death.
As CSIs process the home for fingerprints, detectives head outside to speak with Guy's neighbors, who are devastated by the news of his death.
He was a nice guy, a nice old man. Everybody liked him. I mean, why would anybody hurt this little old guy? I mean, it's especially talking about as brutal as it was.
We have a man whose background is one of a community leader, an individual who's loved.
While neighbors can't think of anyone who might want to harm the 74-year-old, police turn to the forensic evidence for clues.
One of our detectives was able to develop some latent prints.
Investigators checked the prints against the local database. They immediately got a match. A man in the local arrest criminal system named Bradley Martin.
It's a name that police in Lebanon County law enforcement immediately recognize.
Bradley Martin was a 21-year-old inmate at the Lebanon County Prison, and he had been reported missing from the prison about a week earlier. Bradley Martin was awarded a 2-hour pass to leave the prison on September 15th, but when he was supposed to return, he never came back.
But what possible connection did a missing inmate have with Guy Goodman? When authorities check the jail's visitation logs, they get an answer.
In fact, there were visitations, several visitations by Mr. Goodman to Bradley Martin at the Lebanon County Correctional Facility.
Guy Goodman had actually signed up for a program that allowed him to go into the prison and help out, mentor troubled youth. That is how he first connected with Bradley Martin, through his willingness to volunteer. Bradley met him through that program. Guy was trying to help him and turn his life around.
Is it possible that Bradley had killed Guy Goodman after escaping the jail? Police dig into Bradley Martin's background to get more intel on the fugitive.
He came from a good family. The mother was an executive secretary to one of the top officials at Hershey Foods. Father was a teacher at Milton Hershey School for Underprivileged Children.
They are good, salt-of-the-earth, hard-working people.
Despite his positive upbringing, Bradley had fallen in with the wrong crowd as a teenager.
He was in and out of trouble at various times through all of his teens.
He started using alcohol, he started using drugs.
A repeat thief, Bradley had been in and out of jails numerous times.
He had previously served time for a burglary, but was busted for a parole violation not long after his release.
He was serving 23 months on the parole violation.
Before his escape, correctional officers had considered Bradley a model inmate, which allowed him to participate in the jail's work release program.
The work release program is a program that allows trusted inmates to be released on a daily basis to go to work. They leave the prison, they go to their place of employment, and then they come right back to the prison.
He had a job at a facility in Palmyra that did packaging of candy.
Bradley's employers had reported to prison officials that he was a good employee who never missed a shift. And it was while working at the factory that Bradley had met his new girlfriend.
That's where he met Carolyn King.
Carolyn King was a 27-year-old woman who worked at the same factory as Bradley Martin. She thought he was handsome and didn't seem to mind that he was a prison inmate. They grew close very quickly.
More than a week earlier, on September 15th, Bradley Martin had used a 2-hour pass, a weekly perk of his work release program, to meet Carolyn.
As part of that work release program, because of going to work and returning regularly without any infractions, he was granted a conjugal visit evening furlough.
That's something they earned, as long as they followed all the rules.
According to the prison's sign-out sheet, Bradley Martin had planned to meet Carolyn King, but he never signed back in.
Bradley Martin was reported as absconding from the Lebanon County Prison on September 15, 1993. Guy Goodman's body was found on September 25, 10 days later.
That led us to start thinking that Bradley Martin may have been involved in this particular matter.
Detectives immediately put out an APB for Bradley Martin, along with a description for Guy's missing vehicle. They also begin searching for Bradley's girlfriend.
Police were able to get Carolyn King's address from the packaging factory. They went to her residence. She wasn't there.
No one at work had heard or seen Carolyn since Bradley disappeared, so police didn't know if she helped him escape, if he possibly kidnapped her, or if she was in danger.
In Lebanon County, Pennsylvania, authorities are searching for 21-year-old Bradley Martin and his 27-year-old girlfriend, Carolyn King, after Bradley's fingerprints are discovered in the home of 74-year-old murder victim, Guy Goodman.
Based on Bradley Martin's prior criminal record, it didn't seem far-fetched that he could have targeted Guy Goodman for his money and attacked him at his home on September 15th when he left the prison.
With Carolyn King missing, police wondered what, if anything, she had to do with Guy Goodman's death and whether she was with Bradley Martin.
What we didn't know was what was Carolyn King's involvement.
To find out more about Carolyn and where she might have gone, detectives dig into her background and learn the 27-year-old had recently moved to the area.
We were able to find out that Carolyn was originally from Virginia, and we were able to determine that she was married.
In addition to her husband, she had 4 children. The oldest was 12, so all those 4 children were under the age of 12. I was working at HARP, which stands for Housing Assistance and Resource Program. The program was to prevent homelessness. Carolyn King came to us just as any other client would have. I was assigned to her as the caseworker. Her situation was that she was new to the area. She was applying to be placed in an apartment or a rental unit.
Based on Carolyn's application, her husband and children had made plans to join her when financial assistance was granted and Carolyn had settled in. But those plans changed when Carolyn met Bradley Martin.
Carolyn had gotten a job at this candy packaging company where she met Bradley.
It seems like they were drawn to each other. Carolyn King lived in a different state from her husband and children. And Bradley Martin had been in jail many times and appeared to really need somebody to take care of him. So the two were sort of drawn to one another, and Bradley apparently didn't mind that Carolyn was already married.
Carolyn was very persuasive, very charming, attractive, and I think that Bradley became enamored with her.
People who had worked there noticed that they spent a lot of time together during breaks, during lunch.
Soon, co-workers say, it appeared both Carolyn and Bradley had turned their backs on their former lives and began focusing on a future together.
They were very definitely in a relationship. There were records at the prison that Carolyn visited Bradley. They had conjugal visits together, and there was no doubt that they were indeed a couple.
But now both Bradley and Carolyn have vanished without a trace.
Nobody had seen or heard from Bradley or Carolyn since September 15th, and when authorities reached out to Carolyn's husband in Virginia, he hadn't heard from her in weeks.
Detectives are convinced that Carolyn is with Bradley, but where is the couple now? On September 27th, detectives get their first lead when the trace on Guy Goodman's credit card comes in from the bank.
I had a report which showed transactions for the past week traveling through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and going west into Iowa. And the last transactions that we had were in Rapid City, South Dakota.
Somebody went on a cross-country shopping spree courtesy of a dead man.
Detectives reach out to the businesses where the credit card had been used and provide a photo lineup to the clerks.
We had gotten her photograph, put a photo array of 8 photographs of Caucasian males, approximately the same age, 8 photographs of black females, approximately the same age.
Within the hour, detectives receive a positive identification.
The clerks identified Martin and King as the people who were in the store.
Both Bradley and Carolyn were together and making the purchases, each one utilizing the credit card.
At this point, police don't know what to make of Carolyn's involvement. Was she with Bradley willingly, or had she been forced to go along on the road with him? Investigators interviewed some of the store clerks at some of the places where the pair had been, and they all reported that she seemed completely normal and not in any distress.
Most of the clerks described her as the talker. She was described as friendly, engaging, even bubbly.
But police lose the couple's trail when they learn a hotel clerk in South Dakota had put a hold on Guy Goodman's credit card for suspicious activity.
One of the hotels identified Carolyn King as having attempted to check into a hotel in Rapid City utilizing a driver's license of Guy Goodman with her photograph on it and Guy Goodman's credit card. The clerk typed in a code on the credit card usage, which then automatically stopped the use of the credit card.
The clerk confirms that Bradley Martin was also there, and that the couple had quickly left the hotel after the clerk threatened to report them.
As a result, Rapid City, South Dakota Police Department indicated that they were going to begin a search in Rapid City to attempt to locate Bradley and Carolyn in case they were still there.
It isn't long after Rapid City PD begin their search that investigators receive an update from Guy Goodman's bank. Some of Guy's checks had been used at a hotel across state lines.
The checks were written to hotels and/or businesses in Bismarck, North Dakota. I contacted the Bismarck Police Department to advise them who we were and what assistance I was asking of them.
But what the Bismarck Police Department says next turns the entire investigation on its head.
The detective who I was speaking with advised me that He wasn't certain how much information or how much help that they could be because they were busy with the fact that there was a woman missing from a hotel in Bismarck. As they're telling me the name of the hotel that the woman is missing from, I'm looking at a check written to that hotel on Guy Goodman's check, obviously having been passed by Bradley or Carolyn. I'm thinking, oh my God, there's another potential victim.
Coming up, detectives race to track down Carolyn King and Bradley Martin before it's too late.
We don't know whether she's alive, whether she's deceased. We knew that time was of the essence.
And the search for the couple leads to a dangerous high-speed pursuit.
During the chase, he leaned out of the car, and the officer could see that he had a gun.
Suspected killer Bradley Martin and his girlfriend Carolyn King to a North Dakota hotel when they learn a guest at the same hotel has gone missing.
I need to get to Bismarck as quickly as I can to find out if there is a connection as to the time periods when Bradley and Carolyn may have been at this hotel. Does it coincide with this missing woman?
Once in North Dakota, Lebanon County detectives join forces with Bismarck police and the FBI, who share details of their missing person, 59-year-old Donna Martz.
Donna Martz worked as a tour bus guide for a company stationed out of North Dakota.
The tour company would have visits to different places in the United States. And she loved it because she was a people person. She loved being around people. She always had a smile on her face.
Detectives learn that Donna is a resident of Rock Lake, North Dakota, but was in Bismarck following the conclusion of her latest bus tour.
I came home on Saturday night, September 25th, and there was a message on the answering machine, and it was Mom, and it was, "Hi, I'm back. I'll call you when I get home. I love you." It's a 4.5-hour drive, 5 hours, for her to drive home. So she was going to spend the night and go home the next day.
But according to her family, Donna never returned to Rock Lake.
She didn't call. And it's like, well, this is really strange. So I tried calling, phone rang, no answer.
When the family contacted the hotel, no one there had seen Donna or her vehicle.
I just got this terrible feeling. I just went from my head to my toes.
Donna's family had immediately contacted North Dakota police, who then released an APB for Donna's car. Now, with Pennsylvania authorities and the FBI joining the case, they begin tracking Donna's financial activity.
The task force got a report that a credit card of hers was utilized in the western part of North Dakota, in the opposite direction of where she would have been traveling from Bismarck. We were able to watch the video, and we were able to positively identify Bradley Martin and Carolyn King, both utilizing Donna Martz's credit card.
The same day, authorities make another telling discovery.
At the same time, the sheriff's department locates Guy Goodman's car across the river in the next county from Bismarck.
Inside the car, they found fingerprints of Martin and King.
We begin to put out the information to other police departments to the west, to the north, and to the south. At that point, we weren't certain where they were.
Authorities theorized that Carolyn and Bradley had dumped Guy Goodman's car and taken Donna's. But is Donna with them now?
We all know that there is a clock ticking for Donna Martz.
The manhunt for the couple is broadcast on news stations nationwide.
Several of the offices broadcast information about their wanting Bradley and Carolyn and the information on Donna Martz's car.
More than a week later, on October 5th, the media frenzy pays off.
A California highway patrolman spotted the car outside of San Diego.
The patrolman is able to confirm that there are 2 individuals inside the vehicle matching Bradley and Carolyn's descriptions.
When the officer spotted the vehicle, he was able to get close enough to make visual recognition that it was Bradley Martin and Carolyn King. He radioed for backup, but at that point, Bradley and Carolyn realized they were being followed.
And a pursuit began. The California Highway Patrol chased them across the desert and into Yuma, Arizona.
Now, at that point, Bradley had a gun with him. And during the chase, he leaned out of the car. Before Bradley had a chance to point the gun at the officer, Carolyn, who was driving, made a turn, and the momentum pushed him back into the car. They were at an intersection and went through the intersection and bang. The chase ended when they were involved in an accident.
Both Bradley and Carolyn were taken into custody.
Unfortunately, there's no sign of Donna.
At that point, then we still didn't know where Donna was, and they wasn't telling at first either, where they had left Donna.
We're just trying to find where she is and hope that she's alive. We knew that time was of the essence.
With their suspects in custody, the task force sits down with Carolyn King on October 7th.
Right off the bat, Carolyn King denies any knowledge of Guy Goodman or Donna Martz and says she has nothing to do with any of this.
With the evidence stacked against her, FBI agents pressure Carolyn to give up Donna's whereabouts. That's when Carolyn confirms authorities' worst fears.
Carolyn admitted that she had been there when Bradley kidnapped Donna Martz, and then she told detectives that Donna was already dead.
Bradley had wound up murdering her outside of Elko, Nevada.
But Carolyn insists she had no part in any of Bradley's rampage, including the murder of Guy Goodman.
Carolyn told authorities that Bradley had killed Guy Goodman, and she says she was forced to flee Pennsylvania with him.
Carolyn admits that she and Bradley had often talked of running away together as they bonded at work.
Carolyn told the FBI agents that they wanted to get away. They wanted to be together.
But their plans had taken a turn for the worst when Bradley suggested they rob Guy Goodman.
Bradley knew that Mr. Goodman had money. Mr. Goodman had tried to mentor Bradley to try to get his life straightened around. So he knew he could get into his home easily.
According to Carolyn, on September 17th, the couple went to Guy's home during Bradley's 2-hour release from jail.
Carolyn said Guy invited them into his home upon their arrival, and Bradley said that he had been released early from jail. He asked Guy Goodman for money, but Guy refused to help him.
Bradley became upset and hit Guy Goodman.
Martin smashed a vase on top of Guy Goodman's head. He lay on the ground bleeding.
Carolyn says that Bradley had ordered her to collect cords around the home so they could tie Guy up.
They lifted him up. They carried him down into the basement. They tied him up. He was bound with 8 different ties or bindings.
Bradley taped a bag over Guy's head and then wrapped him up in a comforter where he slowly suffocated.
Carolyn told the FBI agents that she was afraid of Bradley and that Bradley had hit her, and she was afraid he was going to do something to her.
She said that he forced me to do it. I didn't want to, and I was just going along because I was scared of him.
According to Carolyn, Bradley then scoured the home for cash before they fled in Guy's car.
After a few days on the road, they realized that police would be monitoring Guy Goodman's credit cards. They were also running low on checks. By the time they made it to North Dakota, Bradley decided they needed more money and a new vehicle.
They was looking for another victim to take, and it just happened to be Donna.
They had watched her carrying her bags and knew that she was alone. They decided they were going to take Donna Martz and take her car and utilize her credit card to continue traveling.
On the morning of September 26th, the day after police had discovered Guy's dead body in Pennsylvania, Bradley kidnapped Donna Martz at knife point.
As Donna was checking out of the hotel, Bradley was behind her. When she turned toward him, he stabbed her in the side and then led her into the parking lot.
Carolyn says Bradley had tied Donna up and forced her into the trunk of her car, where they kept her hostage.
Donna was a prisoner in her own car. She spent 5 agonizing days in the trunk, not knowing what was going to happen to her as Bradley and Carolyn just drove across state lines.
Carolyn says eventually Bradley decided to get rid of Donna. On September 30th, he drove to the Nevada desert and forced her out of the vehicle.
Bradley shot her in the head.
She was then left in the desert in a hope that coyotes and/or other animals would devour her body.
Carolyn says she and Bradley headed for California, where Bradley planned to flee across the border.
Fortunately, police were able to catch the couple before they escaped.
Carolyn continues to claim she was just another victim of Bradley's. To get to the truth, authorities sit down with Bradley Martin and confront him with Carolyn's claims. He confirms what Carolyn had already told them and readily admits to killing both Guy Goodman and Donna Martz.
No remorse, just a factual statement of what took place.
That led me to feel that Bradley Martin was a completely depraved individual.
Despite Carolyn's claims of innocence and Bradley's refusal to throw his girlfriend under the bus, authorities believe she played a larger role in the crime spree.
It was Carolyn King who wrote the checks and signed the receipts when she used the credit cards. It was the clerks who said she didn't seem to be upset or under any sort of duress.
She was alone on many occasions. She could have walked out the door. She could have called 911, and she didn't. She didn't report that, hey, I'm being kidnapped and to go across country and this man is dangerous and call the police. None of that.
We were able to pretty well surmise that she was not an unwilling participant.
Escaped convict Bradley Martin and his girlfriend Carolyn King are in police custody for the murders of Guy Goodman and Donna Martz.
My family called me to let me know that they had been apprehended. My heart broke for my mom, knowing that she was bound and gagged and alive in the trunk of her car, hot days, hot nights, and knowing she couldn't do anything about it.
But loved ones of the victims receive a small ray of hope when both Carolyn and Bradley decide to cooperate with authorities.
They drew a map to where Mom's body was, to the best of their knowledge. And so we were able to bring Mom home. That was one thing I was grateful for, because so many don't get to bring their loved one home, and we did.
That was a relief to know that at least we had her body that could be brought back to North Dakota.
Bradley Martin and Carolyn King are officially charged with theft, kidnapping, and 2 counts of murder. The couple is extradited back to Pennsylvania to await trial.
So how does something like this happen? Bradley came from a good family. He did lead a small life of crime, but it graduates to these horrendous murders. It's unfathomable.
What led 2 young people, Bradley Martin, who was less than 21 years old, why he threw his life away for nothing?
I was terribly shocked to hear that Carolyn was involved in a homicide. She was just so ordinary and so quiet and really refined. I was just amazed that a mother who was seemingly very concerned about her family because she was seeking help could even be capable of committing a crime like she did. I just couldn't believe it.
1 year later, in September of 1994, the joint trial of Carolyn King and Bradley Martin for the murder of Guy Goodman begins in a Lebanon County courtroom. While Carolyn continues to maintain her innocence, Bradley claims he never planned to murder Guy.
His defense was, this was spontaneous. There was no premeditation. And what I did in closing argument was go through everything that happened on the night of the homicide. How long did it take for them to actually do those things? Every single second. They could have stopped, they could have untied him, they could have called an ambulance, and they did not. So every single second was a second of premeditation. And ultimately, that argument was bought by the jury.
On October 11th, 1994, both Carolyn King and Bradley Martin are found guilty of all charges and sentenced to death. Following their convictions in Pennsylvania, Bradley Martin and Carolyn King plead guilty to the murder charges against them in Nevada. They each receive an additional sentence of life without parole.
There was no doubt that these two did this crime. It was just witness after witness, exhibit after exhibit. I've never had a trial in my career where the evidence was more compelling.
I think one of the biggest questions is, why was Carolyn King involved? She didn't have the same type of criminal background as Bradley, but she obviously felt incredibly attracted to Bradley. And anywhere that Bradley went, Carolyn went. And look where it got her.
There was no good reason for Guy Goodman to have died. There was no reason for Donna Martz to have died.
In the end, two innocent people who were well loved by their families as well as their communities at large lost their lives.
45 years is a long time to wait for an answer, especially when the question is why a young woman never came home on a cold February night in 1976. 20-year-old Carla Walker disappeared after leaving a bowling alley in Fort Worth, Texas, with her boyfriend. By the time the night was over, Carla was gone, and a crime that would haunt her family for generations had begun. There was no warning that this ordinary evening would become the last night of Carla's life. She was young. She had plans. She had people who loved her. She was living the kind of life that seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. But within hours, everything would change. The investigation that followed would become one of the most enduring unsolved murder cases in Texas, surviving decades of dead ends, unanswered questions, and painful anniversary. For Carla's family, time never erased the loss. It only made the absence older. The years kept moving while Carla remained 20. Her friends grew older. Her family changed. The world changed. Investigative technology changed. But the central mystery remained frozen in 1976. Who had taken Carla Walker? Who had ended her life? And why had the truth remained hidden for so long? That night began like thousands of other nights in Fort Worth. Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, had gone bowling. There was nothing about the evening that suggested danger. Afterward, they returned to MCCO YS car and prepared to leave. Then a man approached them. What happened next would become one of the most frightening moments in the entire investigation. A man confronted the couple at gunpoint. McCoy was attacked and beaten. Carla was forced into the situation and taken away. In the confusion and violence of those moments, everything changed. McCoy survived. Carla did not. The attacker disappeared with her, leaving investigators with a terrifying mystery and a young woman's family facing the unimaginable. The first hours of a missing person investigation are critical. Families hope every passing minute will bring their loved one home. Investigators search for witnesses, vehicles, physical evidence, anything that might reveal where the missing person went. But in Carla's case, the search quickly became a homicide investigation. Her body was eventually discovered in the Trinity River area, and the evidence showed investigators that she had been murdered. The discovery ended one nightmare and began another. The question was no longer whether Carla was alive. The question was who had killed her. Investigators began examining the events of that night. They had a surviving witness in Rodney McCoy, who had been with Carla when the attacker appeared. McCoy could describe what happened during the abduction and provide information about the attacker. But the attack had been sudden. It was dark. The event was violent and chaotic. The killer had created confusion and then vanished. Investigators worked to identify him, but the case resisted an easy solution. The murder became one of those cases in which investigators knew the crime had happened, but could not make the evidence produce a name. Years began to pass. Carla's family waited. They remembered. They asked questions. They wondered whether the killer was still alive, whether he was living somewhere nearby, whether he had told anyone what he had done, whether someone knew the truth and had remained silent. Every unanswered question added another layer to the mystery. The case became cold, but Carla's family never considered it finished. That distinction mattered. A cold case is a case in which investigators have exhausted the leads available at a particular time. It does not mean the victim has been forgotten. It does not mean the truth has disappeared, and it does not mean evidence cannot someday speak again. For Carla's family, the case remained alive because the person responsible remained unidentified. Then came a development that would eventually become one of the most important pieces of the investigation. Decades after Carla's murder, investigators began revisiting the evidence with modern forensic technology. DNA analysis had changed dramatically since 1976. Evidence that could not have been tested in the same way at the time of the murder could now potentially reveal biological information. Investigators hoped that modern testing could accomplish what earlier detectives had been unable to do. The problem was that the killer had been gone for decades. There was no guarantee that a usable DNA profile would exist. There was no guarantee that it would match anyone in a law enforcement database. And there was no guarantee that the technology would provide a name. But investigators kept working. The case refused to disappear. Then the investigation moved into a new. In 2020, advanced DNA technology and genetic genealogy helped investigators identify a suspect in Carla's murder. The name was Glenn McCurry. He was an older man by then, a person who had lived through the decades while Carla's family carried the memory of a daughter, sister, and loved one who had never had the chance to grow old. The discovery was stunning. 44 years had passed since Carla was killed. A generation had come and gone. Yet investigators had finally reached a person they believed was responsible. But the story did not begin with a family tree or a laboratory. It began with a gunpoint attack in a parking lot in Fort Worth. It began with a young couple whose ordinary evening became a nightmare. It began with Carla being taken away while the man she loved was left behind. And it began with a family receiving the devastating news that their daughter would never come home. The later DNA breakthrough could not change that beginning. It could only finally explain it. Investigators determined that McCurley had been connected to Carla's murder through forensic evidence and genetic genealogy. The identification came after years of investigation and renewed attention to the case. But even then, there was a question that could not be answered by DNA alone. Why Carla? Why that night? Why had the killer taken her? And how had he managed to lie for decades without being identified? Those questions would become even more haunting once investigators began looking closely at the life of the suspect. The passage of time had transformed him. In 1976, the man investigators believed responsible was a young adult. By the time police identified him, he was an elderly man. He had lived through 45 years of history. He had watched the world change. He had lived through technological revolutions that made it increasingly difficult for criminals to remain hidden. Yet for decades, Carla's family had no name to attach to the crime. The eventual identification was therefore more than an arrest. It was the collapse of a 45-year wall of silence. The case demonstrated something investigators had learned repeatedly. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes it gives science an opportunity to catch up with the crime. The biological evidence connected to Carla's murder had remained hidden in the past, waiting for technology capable of extracting information from it. Modern DNA analysis created a profile. Genetic genealogy provided a route toward the suspect. Investigators followed that route. The result was a name that Carla's family had waited decades to hear, but the revelation did not erase the mystery surrounding those first hours. Carla had been 20 years old. Her life had been interrupted violently and without warning. Her family had been forced to live with the knowledge that someone had taken her away. The surviving witness had carried memories of the attack, and the community had carried the knowledge that the person responsible had remained free. For decades, the case existed in the background of Fort Worth's history. Old files accumulated. Memories became less certain. Investigators retired. New detectives inherited the case. The murder became a story that younger generations knew only because older generations refused to forget it. Then modern science brought it back into the headline. The phrase cold case suddenly became arrest. The unidentified killer became a named suspect. The mystery became a prosecution. And the woman whose life had ended in 1976 finally had a chance to speak through the evidence that remained. Carla's story was not simply about a murder that took 45 years to solve. It was about what happens when a crime refuses to disappear. It was about a family that continued waiting. It was about investigators who returned to evidence collected long before modern forensic science existed. And it was about a hidden secret that survived for decades until technology finally forced it into the light. The first breakthrough did not arrive with a dramatic confession or a forgotten eyewitness suddenly appearing at a police station. It came from something invisible: DNA, a biological signature left behind decades earlier. A clue too small to see but powerful enough to cross generations. And once investigators learned how to follow it, the past began opening its door. The secret that had been buried since 1976 was no longer completely buried. Somewhere inside the evidence was a path to the truth. And after 45 years, investigators were finally beginning to follow it. The night Carla Walker disappeared began with nothing that suggested it would become one of Fort Worth's most haunting murder cases. Carla was 20 years old. She was young, energetic, and surrounded by the ordinary routines of life. On February 16, 1976, she went bowling with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. It was the kind of evening that should have ended with a drive home, a good night, and another ordinary morning. Instead, it became the final night of Carla's life. After leaving the bowling alley, Carla and McCoy returned to his car. They had no reason to believe anyone was watching them. No warning, no obvious threat. Then a man appeared with a gun. In seconds, the atmosphere changed. What had been an ordinary evening became a violent confrontation. McCoy was attacked and beaten. Carla was taken. The attacker had controlled the situation quickly, leaving the couple with almost no opportunity to react. McCoy survived the assault, but Carla disappeared into the darkness with the man who had abducted her. That moment became the beginning of a desperate search. For Carla's family, the first hours must have been filled with uncertainty. When someone does not come home, families naturally search for explanations that allow them to believe everything will be all right. Perhaps she had gone somewhere unexpectedly. Perhaps she would call. Perhaps there had been a misunderstanding. But as the hours passed, those possibilities disappeared. Carla was missing, and the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were terrifying. She had not simply walked away. She had been taken at gunpoint. Investigators knew they were dealing with a violent offender. The search therefore began under the assumption that Carla's life could be in immediate danger. Detectives worked to reconstruct the attack. Rodney McCoy became a critical witness because he had been there when the gunman approached. He had experienced the assault firsthand. He could describe what he remembered about the attacker, the weapon, the vehicle, and the sequence of events. But eyewitness memory under extreme stress can be complicated. Darkness, fear, violence, and the speed of an attack can make even important details difficult to remember with complete certainty. Investigators had to work with what they had. Every description mattered. Every possible sighting mattered. Every physical clue mattered. The search for Carla continued, but the hope that she would be found alive was eventually destroyed. Her body was discovered in the Trinity River area. The missing person investigation had become a murder investigation. The emotional impact was enormous. Carla's family now had certainty about what had happened to her, but that certainty came with a terrible price. Their daughter was dead. The question that remained was who had killed her. Detectives now had to investigate the murder itself while also reconstructing the abduction. They needed to understand where Carla had been taken, how the killer had moved her, and whether anyone had seen anything unusual. They needed to determine whether the attacker had acted alone. They needed to identify a motive, and above all, they needed a name. But the case did not produce one quickly. The killer had vanished. The investigation entered the difficult world of 70s-era forensic work. Modern DNA profiling did not yet exist in the form investigators would later depend upon. Detectives relied heavily on witness accounts, physical evidence, interviews, records, and traditional investigative method. The difference between then and decades later would become crucial. Evidence that seemed limited in 1976 could become extraordinarily valuable when tested with technology that did not yet exist, but investigators in that era could not see the future. They could only work with the tools available to them. As the investigation continued, Carla's family waited for news. They wanted justice, but justice seemed distant. The identity of the killer remained uncertain. The years began to move. The 70s became the 80s. The 80s became the 90s. The 20th century ended. The world entered a new millennium. Still, Carla's murder remained unresolved. A case that had once been an active investigation became a cold case. But Carla's name did not disappear. Her family continued to remember her. The investigators who worked the case continued to carry its unanswered questions. The file became part of the history of Fort Worth's unsolved crime. The most painful aspect was the possibility that the killer might still be alive and living an ordinary life. Someone who had committed a violent crime could have blended into the community, built relationships, gone to work, raised a family, and watched decades pass without being confronted. That possibility is one of the most disturbing realities of a long unsolved murder. The victim's life stops instantly, the suspect's life may continue. Carla never reached 21. The person responsible continued aging. That contrast became more dramatic with every passing year. Then, as forensic science advanced, investigators began to see new possibilities in old evidence. DNA technology had transformed criminal investigation. Biological material could potentially produce genetic profiles that detectives in 1976 could never have imagined. Investigators began revisiting old cases, looking for evidence that might still be suitable for modern testing. Carla's case was among those that would eventually benefit from the advances. The possibility was both exciting and uncertain. A DNA test could fail. The biological material could be degraded. The profile could be incomplete. Even a complete profile might not produce a direct database match. But investigators now had something that earlier detectives had not possessed, a way to extract identifying information from biological evidence with unprecedented precision. The old case was no longer limited entirely by the technology of the past. That shift would become decisive. Years after the murder, investigators were able to use forensic DNA analysis to develop evidence associated with Carla's case. But again, there was an obstacle. The DNA profile did not immediately produce the identity of the offender. Investigators knew they had a genetic signature, but they did not yet know whose signature it was. This was the same problem that had defined countless cold cases around the world. DNA can be extraordinarily specific, but only if investigators have a reference point. Without a matching sample, the profile remains unidentified. The technology had brought investigators closer, but not all the way. Then came another scientific revolution. Genetic genealogy allowed investigators to search for relatives of an unknown person through genealogy databases. Instead of asking whether the offender himself had submitted DNA, investigators could examine whether a biological relative had done so. That opened a completely different investigative path. In Carla's case, the genetic information eventually pointed toward a family connection. Investigators could begin constructing a family tree, tracing relationships, and narrowing possible individuals. This was not a simple process. A genetic connection does not automatically identify a murderer. It creates a lead. Investigators must then examine age, location, family relationships, historical records, and other evidence. They must eliminate people who could not have committed the crime. They must verify the final candidate with direct forensic evidence. In Carla's case, that process eventually led investigators toward a man named Glenn McCurley. The name would have been almost impossible to connect to the murder through traditional methods alone. Nearly 45 years had passed. McCurley was no longer the same age he had been in 1976. The world around him had changed, but the evidence had survived. Investigators now had a potential suspect who could be examined using modern forensic methods. The breakthrough was stunning because of the amount of time involved. 45 years is longer than many police careers. It is longer than entire generations of families. It is long enough for witnesses to die and memories to fade. Yet the investigation had found a way to move backward through the decades. The DNA had created a bridge between 1976 and the present. Genetic genealogy had provided a route across that bridge. Investigators followed it carefully. The case that once seemed frozen was moving again. For Carla's family, this development was deeply significant. For decades, they had lived with the absence of an answer. Now, there was a possibility that the mystery could finally be resolved. But there was still a critical question. Was Glenn McCurley truly the person whose biological evidence had been connected to Carla's murder? Investigators needed direct confirmation. A genealogical lead could point them toward a suspect, but only forensic comparison could establish whether the DNA matched. The next stage of the investigation would therefore depend on evidence that could survive the scrutiny of a courtroom. Detectives began working toward that confirmation. They needed to connect the man identified through genealogy to the biological evidence from the crime. Every step had to be careful. Every sample mattered. Every piece of information could either strengthen the case or send investigators back into uncertainty. The family had waited too long for another false lead. The investigation had waited too long for another dead end. This time, investigators needed certainty. Meanwhile, the story of Carla's final night remained at the center of everything. A young woman had gone bowling with her boyfriend. A gunman had appeared. McCoy had been attacked. Carla had been taken. Her body had been discovered. And then the trail had gone cold. Decades later, the same trail was beginning to glow again. It was no longer visible only through old witness statements or fading memories. It was encoded in biological evidence. The killer might have believed that time had erased the connection between himself and the crime. But DNA does not care how many birthdays pass. It does not care how much the world changes. It carries biological information forward, and modern science had finally learned how to use that information in ways investigators in 1976 could never have imagined. The case was approaching a turning point. After decades of uncertainty, investigators had a suspect. They had a genetic trail. They had a reason to believe the secret surrounding Carla's death was finally beginning to unravel. But before that secret could be brought fully into the light, investigators needed one final bridge between genealogy and proof. The name Glenn McCurley had emerged from the past. Now they had to determine whether the evidence could place him directly at the center of Carla Walker's murder. 45 years after that ordinary night at the bowling alley, the question was no longer whether the case could be reopened. It was whether the evidence was finally strong enough to tell the truth. For nearly half a century, the most disturbing detail in the Carla Walker investigation was not simply that the killer had escaped identification. It was that investigators had once come close to him. In the weeks and months after 17-year-old Carla was kidnapped and murdered in 1974, detectives had already encountered the name Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was not a stranger who appeared out of nowhere 46 years later. His name had been part of the original investigation. The problem was that investigators did not have enough evidence to connect him to Carla's murder. That failure would become one of the most haunting elements of the entire case. The killer was not necessarily hidden on the other side of the country. He was not necessarily living under a false identity. According to investigators, McCurley remained in the Fort Worth area for decades, and yet the case stayed unsolved. On the night of February 17, 1974, Carla and her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy, were sitting inside a car in the parking lot of Brunswick Ridgely bowl after attending a dance at Western Hills High School. Suddenly, the car door was pulled open. An armed man attacked them. McCoy was struck with the weapon and knocked unconscious. Carla was pulled from the vehicle. Her screams disappeared into the night as the attacker took her away. A magazine from the gun was left behind in the parking lot. That small piece of evidence became one of the earliest clues investigators had. It was a Ruger .22 magazine. Detectives began tracing firearm purchases in the area, trying to determine who owned a weapon compatible with the magazine. One of the names that emerged was Glenn McCurley. At the time, McCurley lived less than a mile from the location where Carla had been abducted. He had purchased a Ruger .22 pistol. The connection was significant enough that investigators questioned him, but there was a problem. McCurley told detectives that his Ruger had been stolen. According to later court records and reporting, he said the gun had disappeared from his truck around the time of the murder. He also told investigators that his wife had been out of town and that he had not been working during the relevant period. McCurley agreed to take a polygraph examination. He passed it, and investigators did not pursue him further at the time. The case continued without him. That decision would remain buried inside the old investigative file for decades. Carla's family could not know that the man who would eventually be arrested had already been questioned. They could only watch as the investigation stalled. The years that followed were brutal. Carla remained 17 forever. The world around her did not. Her classmates graduated. Her friends became adults. Her family aged. New detectives joined the police department. Others retired. Technology transformed the way crimes were investigated, but the name McCurley remained somewhere inside the history of the case, separated from the crime by an absence of evidence. Then, decades later, investigators reopened the file. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jay Bennett began taking a fresh look at Carla's murder. They were not simply reading the case as a historical document. They were looking for evidence that might still be useful. Old clues were reconsidered. Witnesses were interviewed. The investigation began moving again. And then the most important discovery came from something investigators had possessed for years: biological evidence recovered from Carla's clothing. Earlier testing had not been able to produce the complete genetic information investigators needed, but forensic science had changed dramatically. New DNA extraction techniques could sometimes recover usable profiles from degraded evidence that older methods could not fully analyze. The investigators sent evidence from Carla's clothing to Othram, a forensic laboratory in the Houston area known for working with difficult and degraded DNA samples. The objective was clear: recover as much usable DNA as possible, build a profile, find out whether the evidence could finally identify the man responsible. The work was painstaking. The biological material had survived for decades, but age had damaged it. Every fragment mattered. Every genetic signal mattered. Investigators were attempting something that had been impossible in 1974. They were asking modern science to read evidence collected before DNA profiling had become a standard investigative tool. Eventually, the laboratory succeeded in developing a full male DNA profile from the evidence. But there was still another obstacle. The profile did not match anyone in CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database. The investigation had reached the same wall that had stopped so many cold cases. They had DNA. They did not have a name. But this time, investigators had another option. They turned to genetic genealogy. The concept had already gained national attention after investigators used genetic genealogy to identify the Golden State Killer. The method offered something conventional DNA databases could not. Instead of searching only for the offender, investigators could search for biological relatives of the unknown person. A relative could have voluntarily submitted DNA to a genealogy database. That relative might have no connection to the crime, but shared genetics could reveal a family relationship. Investigators could then reconstruct the family tree and narrow the possibilities. In Carla's case, the genetic search produced an extraordinary result. The DNA pointed toward a family with 3 brothers bearing the surname McCurley. The name immediately caught the attention of detectives Wagner and Bennett because they had seen it before. It was in the old case file. It was connected to a man who had been questioned shortly after Carla's murder. The past had suddenly collided with the present. 46 years after the crime, investigators were looking at the same family name that had appeared during the original investigation. But this time, they had something the detectives of 1974 had never possessed. They had a genetic connection. That did not automatically prove that Glenn McCurley was Carla's killer. It created a powerful investigative lead. The detectives needed to verify it through direct evidence. They began examining McCurley's current life and his history. He had remained in Fort Worth 4 decades. According to police, he had married and raised children. He had worked as a truck driver. His life had continued while Carla's life had stopped. The geographical connection was striking. McCurley had lived less than a mile from the location where Carla was abducted in 1974. He had been interviewed in the original investigation. His name had been connected to the Ruger magazine recovered at the bowling alley. Now, modern DNA analysis was pointing toward his family. The old questions suddenly looked different. What had investigators missed in 1974? Was McCurley's story about the stolen gun true? Had the polygraph created a false sense of closure? Had the biological evidence always been capable of telling the truth if only technology had been advanced enough to read it? The investigation was no longer simply about solving an old murder. It was about revisiting a moment when investigators had been close but unable to make the connection. Detectives needed direct DNA confirmation. In July 2020, officers collected discarded material from outside McCurley's Fort Worth home. The material was sent for testing. Investigators were careful. They did not immediately confront him with the genetic genealogy information. They needed a laboratory result that could establish whether his DNA matched the unknown male DNA recovered from Carla's clothing. The process took time. Then came the result. The DNA from McCurley's discarded material matched the profile developed from Carla's evidence. The connection that investigators had been searching for since 1974 had finally been established. The biological evidence did not care that 46 years had passed. It did not care that the original investigation had ended without an arrest. It did not care that the suspect had grown old. It simply matched. Detectives now had the confirmation they needed, but they still had to confront McCurley. On September 10, 2020, investigators went to his home and interviewed him. According to police, McCurley repeated the same basic story he had given detectives decades earlier. He denied knowing Carla. He denied killing her, but he agreed to provide a DNA sample. The detectives sent that sample for testing. Days later, they received the confirmation. His DNA matched the biological evidence recovered from Carla's clothing. The case that had remained unresolved for 46 years had finally reached the point of arrest. On September 21, 2020, Glenn Samuel McCurley was arrested at his Fort Worth home and charged with capital murder. The image was almost impossible to reconcile with the original crime. In 1974, McCurley had been a young man. In 2020, he was 77. Nearly 5 decades had passed. The world had changed beyond recognition, but investigators had finally connected him to the DNA. The arrest stunned Carla's family. For years, they had wondered whether they would ever know who killed her. Now there was a name, there was a fate, there was evidence, and there was a suspect who had once been interviewed during the original investigation. Brother Jim Walker had waited nearly his entire adult life for that moment. The emotional impact was immense. The family had spent decades living with the knowledge that the killer remained unidentified. Now they could finally look at the person investigators believed responsible. But the arrest also created a painful question that would echo through the case. How had this man remained free for so long? The answer was partly technological. The DNA tools that ultimately identified McCurley did not exist in 1974. Investigators could not perform the genetic analysis that would later become decisive. They had the gun magazine. They had a witness. They had McCurley's name. They had his explanation, but they lacked the biological evidence capable of making the connection. The case, therefore, became a chilling example of the limits of forensic science in one era and its power in another. The evidence had not suddenly appeared. The technology had. The arrest also demonstrated why cold case investigations sometimes require investigators to question conclusions reached decades earlier. A suspect may have been interviewed and released. A lead may have been considered weak. A test may have seemed persuasive at the time, but none of those conclusions are necessarily permanent. New evidence can change the meaning of old evidence. New science can reopen doors that once seemed permanently closed. In Carla's case, the door had been closed for 46 years. Then a DNA profile opened it again, and behind that door was a name investigators had seen before. Glenn McCurley, the man whose name had once been only a lead, was now facing a capital murder charge. The case was no longer a mystery without a suspect. It was a prosecution waiting to unfold, and the evidence was preparing to tell a story that the investigators of 1974 had never been able to hear. The arrest of Glenn Samuel McCurley did not immediately erase the mystery surrounding Carla Walkerest's murder. It created something investigators had not possessed for nearly half a century: a living defendant. But an arrest is not a conviction, and a DNA connection is only the beginning of a courtroom battle. For Carla's family, the moment was overwhelming. The man whose name had appeared in the original investigation was now facing a capital murder charge based on evidence that had been recovered from Carla decades earlier. The case had crossed an extraordinary distance in time. Carla had been 17 when she was abducted. McCurley was 77 when detectives finally arrested him. Between those two ages stood almost an entire lifetime. Yet the evidence connecting them came from something that had remained hidden inside an evidence room for decades. The breakthrough began when detectives Leah Wagner and Jay Bennett reopened the case in February 2020. They started with what remained of the original investigation: boxes of reports, old interviews, physical evidence, names of witnesses, names of suspects, and details that had once seemed important but had never produced an arrest. They did not know that the most important clue was waiting inside a piece of clothing Carla had been wearing on the night she disappeared. Advances in DNA extraction allowed forensic scientists to recover a full male profile from biological material found on Carla's bra. Earlier testing had not produced the same level of information. The evidence had been examined before, but technology had not been capable of extracting everything that remained. Now it was different. Investigators could finally see a genetic profile where earlier detectives had seen only limited biological information. The profile was uploaded into CODIS, the National Law Enforcement DNA database. No match appeared. The breakthrough could have ended there. But investigators had another option. They turned to genetic genealogy. The unknown DNA profile was submitted to GEDmatch, a genealogy database that had become known for its role in helping investigators identify unknown offenders through relatives. The search did not immediately produce the name of the killer. Instead, it produced a family connection. Investigators were led toward three brothers with the surname McCurley. That surname stopped the investigation cold for a different reason. Detectives recognized it. It was not an unfamiliar family name pulled from an enormous database. It was the name of a man who had already appeared in the Carla Walker file in 1974. The past had returned with a genetic signature. McCurley had been interviewed less than 2 months after Carla's murder because of a detail that had seemed important at the time. A Ruger .22 magazine had been found in the bowling alley parking lot after Carla was abducted. Investigators traced purchases of Ruger firearms and identified McCurley as someone who had recently purchased a .22 Ruger. On April 3, 1974, detectives questioned him. He was 31 years old. He worked as a truck driver and lived less than 2 miles from the bowling alley. He told investigators that his Ruger had been stolen while he was fishing. He said he had not been working on the night Carla disappeared and that his wife had been out of town. Investigators considered him suspicious, but they did not have enough evidence to make an arrest. After that interview, McCurley disappeared from the investigative spotlight. Not physically, he continued living his life, but as far as the murder investigation was concerned, his name went quiet for decades. The new genetic evidence changed that completely. Now investigators had to determine whether the family connection truly led to him. The answer would come from direct DNA testing. Police began monitoring McCurley and collecting discarded material. According to investigators, officers recovered items from the trash outside his home, including a McDonald's straw. The DNA from that material was compared with the male profile recovered from Carla's bra. The result was a match. Suddenly, the family tree had produced a specific individual, But investigators did not stop there. They wanted another sample. McCurley eventually consented to provide a direct DNA sample through mouth swabs. Again, the result matched the DNA recovered from Carla's clothing. The chain of evidence was becoming extraordinarily difficult to dismiss. The genetic genealogy had produced the lead. The discarded material had produced the first direct connection. The mouth swabs provided further confirmation. The man whose name had appeared in the original investigation was now directly connected by DNA to biological evidence recovered from Carla. On September 21st, 2020, McCurley was arrested at his Fort Worth home. The arrest itself was the moment that transformed a decades-old mystery into a modern criminal prosecution. Detectives no longer needed to ask who might have killed Carla. They believed they had the answer, but McCurley did not simply accept the accusation. In interviews after his arrest, he denied killing Carla. He offered an explanation for what had happened that night. He claimed he had been drinking and driving around when he saw Carla and Rodney in the bowling alley parking lot. He said he believed Rodney was attacking Carla and that he intervened. His version of events was dramatically different from the prosecution's theory. He claimed he had not abducted Carla in order to harm her. He suggested that he had been trying to help her, but the DNA evidence told